Okay, well, hello everyone. My name's Graham Cookson, also from the department, and I'll be around at the end as well if you've got any questions specifically about the Public Services Policy Management Programme, which I currently teach on, and will be shortly taking over the role of director. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about this report that I wrote. It was commissioned by the Law Society, and they wanted me to look at the unintended consequences, so the stuff that the government didn't admit to when it proposed changes to the legal aid system in the UK. So I guess before we go, the key thing is to just make sure everyone understands what we mean by legal aid. And essentially it's a system in which people who can't afford legal advice have that advice paid for them by the state. But also the other key part of that is that solicitors that sign up to provide legal aid do so at a dramatically reduced rate. So it's about a quarter or a third of commercial private sector legal rates. It's been going for well over 60 years. It was introduced as part of the whole beverage change, the introduction of the welfare state, and it was really about addressing this problem of equality of access. Rich people could afford legal advice, they could get the best solicitors, they could go to court, they could get their way with almost everything, and many people, if you didn't have access to legal aid, you simply gave in. Okay, so there's an imbalance of power. And it's been said by Anthony Hoyle that it's one of the three pillars of the welfare state. That's with education and healthcare. And it's a bit of a myth that everybody seems to get legal aid, that it's a really expensive, big system. But actually 80% of people who get it are in the bottom income quartile. Okay? Now most of you are about to become students, so you may think, well, okay, that seems like quite a lot of people. Anyone have a guess at what that income would be? How much would you be earning in a year if you were in the bottom quartile? So the bottom 25% of earners. 8,000? Okay. Anything else? 10,000? We're going up? No? Okay. Well, the top of that 25%, everybody earns below £5,000 a year. And the median, so the average of that 25%, is about £3,500 a year, okay? So we're not talking about people who are on a lot of money, okay? So we're talking about some relatively poor people. Now, set against that very low income, anybody have any idea how much rip-off solicitors charge in London, where they're more expensive, for a divorce? And we're talking about an undefended divorce. So this is where a husband and wife are getting divorced, and they agree, and this is very rare, on who gets what. Okay, so there's no contention, there's no kind of let's go to court and fight about this. We agree, just draw up a document, take it to the court. How much would that cost you in London, on average? No, for the whole thing.
600 per hour.
Okay. Anything else? It's going to cost you £1,000 just to get a divorce when you agree. It's going to cost you about £5,000 for a divorce when you disagree. Okay? So what we're talking about here, and that divorce is relatively straightforward, okay? There's hundreds of thousands of divorces. Now, if you start thinking about more complex areas of law, like clinical negligence, when you want to sue the NHS for medical malpractice, that's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of pounds in legal fees. And you're expected to try and afford this with a very low income. So today I'm going to talk about four things. I'm going to briefly talk about why the government would introduce this policy, so what's their rationale, and then also the rationale for the study, so why is it interesting to look at this. And then I'm going to tackle a couple of myths that the government were spreading about legal aid and the legal aid scheme in the run-up to the law, and then going to talk about the key findings. So what did I find? What were the outcomes of my research? And then if we have time at the end, I'll talk about some of my observations about working with the Ministry of Justice. So, okay, so what's this all about? Well, the history, you've got to have lived in a cave if you didn't realise that we had a global financial crisis, and the coalition government came to power, and their response to that was what they called fiscal responsibility, to which everybody else means belt-tightening, okay? And they made a commitment then in that budget in 2010 that they would eradicate the structural deficit by 2015, okay? So effectively we're going to have a balanced budget in up cycles and down cycles. And they thought it was going to cost £99 billion per annum trimmed out of the expenditure to meet that. Okay, and that's current spending, so that's not even capital expenditure. We're probably talking £140 billion per annum is being cut out of the real budget. So how did they implement that? Well, they had a spending review where all the departments get told what their budget allocation is for the next period, and on average each department had to cut 19%, okay? And some got off easier, like the NHS, some got off worse. So the MOJ, Ministry of Justice, that we're looking at here, they had to find 23% savings, okay? So imagine trying to strip out a quarter of your budget. So here we are, the Ministry of Justice. The ministers, Ken Clarke, sat down and he has to find £2 billion per annum to cut out of his budget. And he's looking around and he's got, what has he got? He's got prisons. Brilliant. Well, let's cut spending on prisons. What we're going to do, just let everyone out. That's not going to work. So he's looking around for areas to tackle, and a big one is going to be the legal aid budget, because that's about a quarter of their total budget at £2.1 billion per annum. So it's a big pie to tackle. And the argument that they had was this expenditure is too great. We spend far too much money on legal aid. Look at comparison countries like New Zealand. And what is special about legal aid? It shouldn't be immune to public sector cuts, just like defence, just like policing, just like everything else. So you're going to have the knife taken to you. And their solution was to trim £450 million per annum. But that's even worse, because that comes specifically out of the civil legal aid budget of £900 million. So basically half of the civil and family legal aid budget is being cut. There's no real change to the criminal bit. So how did they do this? Well, they introduced a bill into Parliament called the Legal Aid, Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Bill at the time, LASPO. And it's now an act because it became law at the beginning of the month. It will be implemented from next year. And it was highly controversial. I mean, the NHS bill and the social care bill, that was highly controversial. This is probably second behind that in terms of the level of controversy. There were 14 defeats during its passing through Parliament, and part of that was down to the work that I did. House of Lords here, we've got Lord Howarth. I would do an old guy's kind of posh accent, but I won't because it's embarrassing. But he said, I hope that it will look, it being the government, at the arguments and figures put forward by Dr. Cookson of King's College, the central case on which the minister relies, that all this, miserable though it may be, is inescapably necessary in order to reduce the deficit, is profoundly flawed. I hope that on report we will see major amendments to the bill. And indeed there were 15 amendments to the bill, largely around the work that I was doing on whether or not it was going to make any money. And in the end the government tagged it as a spending bill, and any of the people who studied government before, the rule is if it's a spending bill that you're not allowed to vote against it no matter which side of the house you are. So they forced it through as though it were a budget. So how are they going to make £450 million savings? Well, they tweak a little bit with eligibility, that is who is covered. Quite a big chunk of it comes from the fees, so taking a haircut to the hourly rates that solicitors can charge. But the vast majority here, 60% of the savings, come from what's called scope. So that's what type of law is covered. So family law is a type of scope. And I was looking specifically at what is the impact of removing these whole areas of law out of scope, family law, clinical negligence, and so on. So within the area of scope, the big hit is family. 61% of the family budget has disappeared. That basically means everything's gone. The only cases that remain in scope are for what's called public family law, so baby P cases, like those kind of things. Clinical negligence, 4%, and social welfare. And those three things are what I focused on in my report, and that's about 86% of the savings, mainly because they're the most contentious. So the government, whenever it passes a law, it has to come out with an impact assessment in which it owns up to what it thinks the benefits of this law is going to be in financial terms and the costs. And these are what it thought were going to be the costs of the legal aid bill. Increased criminality, some idea that you can't get access to your child, so you kidnap them and run away to France or something. Increased transfer payments, you can't say, you can't get part of your husband's pension through a divorce, so you might be reliant on state benefits for the rest of your life, things like this. So the government owned up to them, but when it came to putting a figure on it, it said that the lack of robust evidence base means that we are unable to draw conclusions as to whether wider economic and social costs are likely to result from the programme of reform, or to estimate their size. So basically they said, yeah, there's loads of stuff that's bad about this bill. We haven't got a clue how much it's going to cost, so we'll call it zero, okay, because that seems right. So what you've got is £450 million saving and a zero cost. even though we know that that's frankly ridiculous. So in response to this, going crazy here, the Justice Select Committee said that they were surprised that the government was proposing to make such changes without assessing their likely impact on spending from the public purse. And they asked them to do that. And basically, that was the aim of this study. I was to look at the likely impact of the legal aid changes. So the government had two main arguments that I think are myths about why legal aid should be reformed. The first one was that it's too expensive. Okay, without defining what expensive means. So this is a bar chart. If you come and do PSPM or you do stats with me, you'll spend a lot of time looking at bar charts, maths, all sorts of stuff. It's good. So what we got, a decade here of spending, and each of those bars there represents total expenditure, and then they're split between the light green, which is on top, which is the criminal legal aid, and the bottom bit is the civil. And if you look, it's pretty remarkably stable over that decade, really. I mean, it's not moving by a lot. And actually, if you take the beginning and the end of the decade, civil legal aid, which is the thing being cut, has fallen by 6%. Okay? So it's actually lower at the end of the decade. But the world doesn't stay still. Over that decade, the UK economy grew by 15%. The population grew by 6%. And this is against a backdrop of increased spending under Labour. The police got 50% extra spending. The health service a quarter. So whilst everything else was spending much more money, we were actually spending less on legal aid. So I don't think it's true that we spend too much money. And then there's what I've called the New Zealand problem, which is whenever Ken Clarke was wheeled out, he comes up with this parrot-like argument that we spend so much more, 4 times as much per capita than New Zealand spends on legal aid, and they have a similar legal system, okay? Well, anyone been to New Zealand? We're not very similar, okay? What type of law is covered, for example? Does it cover the range of cases that we cover? Who's covered? Is it everybody that falls within a certain income level, or is it just a small minority? And the big one is purchasing power parity, which is an economic term, and we economists like these kind of things. But basically it means how much can your dollar buy you in the UK or can buy you in New Zealand, and money goes a lot further in New Zealand generally. So actually, even though they're spending less, they probably buys more for their money. And so what if we spend more? The question is that value for money as a society? Do we think that we get something out of it? So the key findings. On the left here, we've got what the government was proposing to save from the 3 areas of law. So family law was about 160 million, and then we had social welfare law, and then clinical negligence. So this is what it thought it was going to save. And this is what I predict it will cost to offset against that. And with some areas of law, this is clinical negligence. You don't need to be a mathematician to see that's considerably bigger than that. And so for every £1 that the Ministry of Justice saves, the NHS will lose £3. Okay? Every £1 that they save costs the NHS £3. And we'll talk in a minute about why that is. And then with other areas of law, we'll see that they don't necessarily save as much as they would like. And when we combine that, the government's lucky to save around 40% of what it predicts, okay? And that's being generous. If you have the time to read my report, you'll see there's loads of things we can't estimate. And generally, as an academic, I tended to be more cautious than, say, the Law Society might have liked me to be. And so that's probably an underestimate. So what we're looking at here is a reform which takes legal aid away from 600,000 people every year and is going to save less than £100 million a year. Okay? I mean, we can save £100 million probably just by not doing the gardens at the Olympic site. This is not a lot of money. Okay? The government wants to spend £99 billion, and this isn't the way to go. So where do these costs come from? Well, we've got lots of them here. What we have here, 52.8 billion. We've got a big cost here for what we might call alternative advice. So the government's reason for cutting legal aid is there are other things you can do. If you want a divorce, you don't need a lawyer. You can go to the Citizens Advice Bureau and see some very well-trained volunteers, and they can tell you how to get a divorce yourself. And they may be good or they may be bad, but the point is the government thinks that that doesn't cost them any money. But Citizen Advice, Shelter, all of these organisations are charities. And how are charities funded? They're funded through money out of your pocket, right? Everybody donates. And when you donate, they claim tax back from the Treasury. So for every pound that you give that charity, they also get about 55% back from the government, depending upon taxpayers' rates and things. So actually, the government, the Ministry of Justice saves money, but the Treasury loses money if people have to spend more money at the citizens' advice propping them up. The government is very keen on mediation, especially in family cases. So the argument goes, you're too willing to litigate, get solicitors involved. You should sit down with a mediator and mediate, sort this problem out between you. And so it's going to fund mediation. But the government reckons that even though it's cutting 600,000 people's legal aid, that only 4,000 extra people will seek mediation each year, even though it's not capping the numbers. So I predicted, through some nice modelling that you can read in the report, that we're going to see many, many, many more people, 20, 30, 40,000 people using mediation each year, which comes at considerable cost. Other areas that are important, people will give up. If you can't get legal advice, you might just give up on your problem. And that could be really serious if you've got, say, you have a child and during birth it gets a brain injury and you have to look after them for the rest of your life. You might have gone to court to try and get money off the NHS for that. But if you no longer do that, you're going to be reliant on the state forever. And so there's costs to giving up. I'm not sure how long we've been talking for, but I'm happy to come back to this at the end and talk about any of this in detail. But here are the headlines, really. Those in greatest need will suffer. The bottom 80% of people in the bottom 25% of the income bracket, they're relatively poor. It's a false economy. MOJ may save money, but it's simply shifted to other parts of government. There's a health warning in here that there's so much stuff that we couldn't estimate that we really think that this number is going to be significantly bigger. And in some areas, like with clinical negligence, the cost is going to be greater than the saving. And it's absolutely ridiculous that the government thought that they would cut legal aid for clinical negligence where it's going to cost them 3 times as much as they save. And the one thing I did learn was that the MOJ has very poor data, hasn't got a clue what's happening. And I won't say it because we've got a camera, but you can ask me afterwards about how they came up with some of their figures. Okay, so how do we summarise this? Well, just 2 words really. It's a false economy. It's a big waste of time. We have an idea in the UK that we have a right to justice. It goes all the way back to the Magna Carta. It goes all the way through most of the principles that we have in this country. We have a right to justice. And even Ken Clarke has said several times that access to justice is a hallmark of a civil society, including in the introduction to the bill that basically destroyed legal aid, which was the key way we have of ensuring access to justice. So the question that I keep getting asked at all the interviews I've done and all the presentations is, why did the government do this? And I have no answer. So you might want to think on that. I haven't got a clue. Why would they do this? I mean, if you want, you can download the full report. KCL report, tiny URL, and contact details if you want them, but you can find us all on the web. We're all up there. Okay? Fine.